In my Hotline Miami video, I made a slight dig at Arkane Studios. I said that enemies in Hotline Miami will actually hear you and sprint towards you whilst unloading their weapons, as this isn't an Arkane game. This dig was based on the Arkane games Deathloop and Redfall, two games that I actually haven't played. In fact, when I said this statement, I hadn't played any Arkane games. I doubt anyone is going to stand up for Redfall. It is a very infamous disaster for the studio and will probably go down as one of the biggest flops in gaming history. Not just because it ended Arkane's winning streak, but also because it was the first AAA exclusive that Xbox had delivered in some time. Let's just hope that the game doesn't take Arkane down with it. Saying that the AI in Redfall is bad is like someone giving you a burnt cake and saying that they didn't use enough eggs. Nothing was done right in Redfall. Deathloop, on the other hand, is a little more divisive. People seem to disagree over whether the game is good or whether it is great. However, a lot of people did complain about the AI in the game being really dumb, and from the videos I saw of Deathloop, the AI did seem really dumb. They would just straight up ignore everything that the main character did. You could kill an enemy in front of another enemy and they would just sit there like nothing happened. That's why I made the comment in my Hotline Miami video. Now that I've explained myself over a comment that literally no one called me out on, let's get to the real meat of this video. Because I felt a bit guilty about throwing some shade at a developer that I'd never given a fair shake to, I decided to play Dishonored. By the way, I've always wanted to play Dishonored. When I was younger, I really liked playing stealthy games like Splinter Cell because they usually weren't that difficult. In most games, you would usually have to have a back and forth with your enemies as you duke it out, but when you play a stealth game, you get to one-shot everyone. It would feel like putting on the cheat mode, and I got that same feeling from Dishonored. Because if you try and fight people head on in this game, you'll most likely get swarmed by loads of guards and then killed. My dig at Arkane clearly didn't apply to Dishonored, therefore stealth is clearly the best option to go with when playing Dishonored. But what is Dishonored even about? Dishonored is about a guy named Corvo who is secretly, but everyone actually knows, is banging the Empress. Anyway, one day the Empress gets assassinated and her daughter gets kidnapped. Corvo, who was in the wrong place at the wrong time, gets accused of her murder and is then arrested. 6 months or something pass and Corvo is broken out of jail by a group of guys who want his help in getting revenge on the people that ordered the Empress's murder. They also want to rescue Emily Cauldron, the Empress's daughter, and have her claim the throne. That's it. That's the story. Yes, there's some supernatural mumbo-jumbo going on too, and there's also a plot twist about 2/3 into the story that you might see coming, but other than that, the story of Dishonored is overall very simple. And I'll be honest, after playing the DLC for Dishonored, and beating Dishonored 2 and Dishonored Death the Outsider, I was really grateful for how simple the story was in Dishonored 1, because the story in Dishonored gets more complicated after Dishonored 1, but not more interesting, but I'll talk more about those game stories soon. Don't worry. The story in Dishonored 1 has a greater level of focus and feels more personal because Corvo is rescuing Emily, and each mission feels like a stepping stone to that goal. It's also about revenge, which is something that many players can get behind, especially when the villains are just so simplistically evil. It also helps that Dishonored has an actual base of operations that you return to at the end of every mission. The Helm Pit's pub is kinda like the camp from Red Dead Redemption 2. There are quite a few characters at this pub for you to talk to. You can learn about your allies and even upgrade your weapons and restock on supplies. This hub area also really added extra layers to certain missions, as some of the characters that Corvo lives with will have links with some of your assassination targets. For example, for one of the missions, you need to assassinate Trevor Pendleton's twin brothers. Because you spent time with this character and potentially spoken to him a few times and found out some information about him, it adds some extra weight to the fact that your targets are his relatives. And perhaps it may be a little awkward returning on Samuel's boat to let their brother know that you just brutally eviscerated both of his siblings. Or how before one mission, Callista comes up to you asking you to spare her uncle, a man who just happens to be right next to your assassination target. Because of the Helm Pit's pub and the people there, you get some extra depth to the missions that you're about to go on. It could also factor into your decision on whether or not you choose to go with a high or low chaos playthrough. Right out the gate, the game makes it clear that depending on how you choose to play this game, you will end up with either a good ending or a bad ending. If you slaughter your way through every man, woman and child in this game, then not only will you get a bad ending in the game, but the levels themselves will actually react to your evilness. There'll be even more rats and weepers around to feast on you, more guards for you to brutally tear apart. Your allies will look at you disapprovingly, and Emily will turn into a horrible person. When you hear this, it's no surprise that a lot of people, myself included, ultimately decide to play this game as pacifist as possible. Now initially, I hated the high chaos, low chaos aspect of the game. Whilst it encourages replayability, it discourages the player from using every tool at their disposal. In this game you receive supernatural abilities, all of which look cool and sound cool. You have a teleportation ability, you have Batman's detective vision ability, Everyone will use these abilities, but not everyone's going to use the Devouring Swarm ability, which is a superpower that allows Corvo to summon a swarm of rats to eat your enemies. How badass is that? I don't know, because I never used it because I was going for a low chaos playthrough. Fortunately, I've played a Plague Tale Innocent, so I've seen my fair share of humans devoured by rats, but it would have been cool if I didn't feel pressured by the game not to use it. Even abilities like Wind Blast I felt I shouldn't use because even though it shouldn't kill guards unless you upgrade it, it still did. I sent a guy flying into a wall hoping that it would knock him out, and instead he died. So I rarely, if ever, used any abilities other than Blink and Dark Vision, and the occasional bit of Possession. It's an issue exacerbated by the fact that there are more options available to kill an enemy than to take them out non-lethally. You can use the Wind Blast and Rat Swarm like I previously mentioned, but you also have a gun, your sword, which by the way has a really cool animation when you put it away, a crossbow, grenades, sticky grenades, whale oil tanks. You can rewire things so they kill guards instead of you. There are so many ways to kill an enemy in this game, but to knock them out, all you have are some sleep darts and a strong headlock. Having the player choose between a lethal and non-lethal playthrough is fine. I just wish that there was more available for the non-lethal, especially as the game makes it clear that non-lethal will lead to a better outcome. It's also a little disappointing because there's so much choice in how you can approach the levels in Dishonored. I'm not just talking about going in guns blazers or sneaky, no, I mean there are so many nooks and crannies in the levels for you to take advantage of. No two players, regardless of whether they choose to go in lethally or non-lethally, will have the same experience in these levels. The level design in Dishonored is some of the best I've ever seen in a video game, as it truly does give you the freedom to tackle a level however you see fit. There are parts of these levels that some players won't even see as they didn't happen to go in a certain direction. This freedom is another part of Dishonored that makes it even more replayable. These levels also have side content for you to decide whether you want to do or not. They come with their own rewards, whether it be runes or bone charms, or whether it gets you just that little bit closer to taking out your target non-lethally. There was a lot for you to choose to do in Dishonored's levels, and if you ever needed more proof that not every game needs to be open world, then Dishonored is definitely the answer. I'd rather have a smaller level that is packed to the brim with options and creativity than a large empty open world where everything in that world just feels the same. In addition to all the supernatural abilities at Corvo's disposal, there's also a steampunk looking heart that you can use. It will show you where the runes and bone charms are on the map. Runes being what you need to unlock abilities and upgrade them, and bone charms being these charms that will give Corvo some extra enhancements going into levels. The heart will also tell you some extra information about the levels you're in, and if you aim the heart at characters, then it will reveal things about that character. These character revelations were actually really cool because it gave me a better sense of who my allies actually were, and led to some great foreshadowing for a plot twist later in the game.
As the bloodlust, he tried to seize control of the military after the Empress. After the Empress was murdered.
All in all, Dishonored is a great game with a simple yet engaging story, brilliant level design with more freedom than the majority of games, and gameplay that is fun and promotes replayability. However, we are not just here to talk about Dishonored. Yes, that's right, we're moving on to the Dishonored DLC, which in my opinion just might be the weakest part of Dishonored. It's this or Dishonored Death of the Outsider? I'm not sure. But anyway, is the DLC still good? Yes, and it is essential to the story of Dishonored 2. This is one of the reasons why I said the story in Dishonored gets more complicated after the first, as you do need to have played the DLC to fully understand what's happening in Dishonored 2, and then of course the story setup here fully wraps up in Death of the Outsider. However, as you may have guessed, I'm not the biggest fan of the story in the Dishonored DLC. That's mainly due to the fact that I don't like Delilah. The DLC as you play as Daud, the man who murdered the Empress. Daud isn't doing too well after killing her, seemingly regretting his actions. After a little chat with the Outsider, Daud realises that he needs to take down Delilah, Queen of the Witches, or however they refer to her. Now Corvo was a silent protagonist in Dishonored, but Daud actually does speak, a feature that continues into both Dishonored 2 and Dishonored Death of the Outsider. I'll be honest, I think in Dishonored's case I preferred having a silent protagonist, at least during the actual missions, but I didn't hate that Daud spoke. It was a good way for his character to develop in the game. I also really liked Daud's companion in the game, Billy Lurk. Clearly I wasn't alone in that since she ends up playing a huge role in both Dishonored 2 and Death of the Outsider. But anyway, the story of the DLC is about Daud and his assassins trying to kill some witch that I didn't care about. But are there any major differences to the gameplay or level design? The level design is equally as good as it was in the main game. I'm not going to repeat my praises here. Overall, the gameplay is pretty similar to that of Dishonored. You can still choose to go for a high or low chaos playthrough. You can still get a good or bad ending to this game depending on your lethality. Daud's abilities are very similar to Corvo's. He has the same blink ability as Corvo. He may not have the heart like Corvo did, but Daud can still locate runes and bone charms with his void gaze ability, an ability that also allows him to see through walls to see enemies and objects. He can also bend time like Corvo. Daud does have two additional abilities that Corvo didn't have, just to add some distinction between the characters. Daud has the ability to summon one of his assassins to fight alongside him, although I never use his ability since it seems like an ability for a high chaos playthrough, and the ability to pull objects and enemies towards him, which is a really cool ability regardless of playstyle, since you could just pull an enemy towards you and either assassinate him or choke him out. Other than those two abilities though, the Dishonored DLC feels very similar to Dishonored, which isn't an issue. But essentially, all my positive about Dishonored 1 can be applied to the Dishonored DLC, and all my negatives about Dishonored 1 can also be applied to the Dishonored DLC, although I like that Daud has more sleep darts than the Corvo did, and I really didn't care about Delilah as a villain at all. If Dishonored and its DLC can be considered great, then Dishonored 2 is incredible. Dishonored 2 takes almost everything good about the first game and improves it. There are a few things I like a little less and some features from the first game that I miss, but overall, Dishonored 2 is a vast improvement over the first game, and the first game was already a great game to begin with. First, what is the story of Dishonored 2? While everyone's favourite villain Delilah has returned from the DLC, you thought that you beat her as Daud. Turns out you were wrong because she's back to reclaim her throne. Yes, her throne, because she's actually the long-lost sister of the Empress and is therefore the rightful Empress, not Emily, the Empress's daughter, because that's how succession works. Then the game gives you a choice: play the entire game as Corvo like you did in Dishonored, or beat the game as Emily. This is another decision that Arkane made to boost the replayability of the series, but like the lethal non-lethal decision, it was initially one I didn't like having thrust upon me. I knew that you could choose to play as either character in this game, but I was hoping that it would be a mission by mission basis, or that certain missions could only be played as Emily and others as Corvo. The reason why I wanted this is due to whichever character you didn't choose to play as will end up being turned to stone by Delilah. I didn't really like that. This is because in the first game, the relationship between Corvo and Emily is one of, if not the most important in the game. Dishonored 2 completely gets rid of that relationship in this game, as Corvo and Emily only interact in the tutorial, the start of the game, and at the very end of the game. I really wish that this game had furthered their relationship instead of choosing to shine the spotlight on them separately. It also doesn't help that neither Emily nor presumably Corvo form a relationship more meaningful than the one that they shared in the first game. Yes, that's right, I chose to play as Emily in this game. I ummed and ahed over who to play as. I was leaning more towards Corvo until I read that Emily's playthrough is the canon one, so I chose to go with her and follow her quest to reclaim the throne. How does Emily fare as the protagonist? Like Daud, I think I preferred the simple silence of Corvo from the first game. I know that Corvo would have spoke had I picked him for Dishonored 2, but if you were hoping that Emily was going to be this brilliant protagonist, then I'll tell you right now, she isn't. She's just a perfectly fine character in my opinion, neither good or bad. If you're wondering why I'm being so negative towards Dishonored 2, it's because I'm trying to get all the negatives out of the way so that we can get to all the positives. The story I've already said that I didn't like as much as the first games. That's completely to do with the villains of this game. None of them were particularly memorable. That's also true of the first game, but the final villains of the first game were better than the villains in this one. The only reason you'll remember a villain in this game is because of how good the level they were attached to was, hence why you might remember Jindosh or the Duke, but the ending to this game was so anticlimactic. First of all, you're fighting Delilah, which even if you do like the character, unlike me, is exactly how the Dishonored DLC ended. Then when you do beat her, you get a little cutscene and then roll credits. It just wasn't very satisfying for me. I'm not saying the ending is bad, but if you were hoping that the ending was going to be a high point of the game, then you would be very disappointed. My other major issue is, and allow my English to rear its head, but you just can't beat a pub. The Houndpits pub is a significantly better hub than the Dreadful Whale, not just because there's more to explore at the Houndpits pub than the Dreadful Whale, but also because of the people at the Houndpits pub. Like I said before, there were quite a few characters at the Houndpits pub, and it was great to hang out with them. The Dreadful Whale only has Megan, who I'll be honest, I didn't really care for, and Sokolov, who is a shell of his former self. Yeah, a couple other characters can join the Dreadful Whale depending on your choices, but they don't really bring anything to the table. The Houndpits pub was very memorable, but the Dreadful Whale, despite returning for the death of the outsider, had very little to offer. My only other complaint about Dishonored 2 is that the dark vision ability was worse in this game than the first one. That could be because I chose to play as Emily instead of Corvo, but I remember dark vision being more useful in the first game. Firstly, in Dishonored, highlighted enemies stood out more, and secondly, in Dishonored 2, it seems to work more like a pulsing area of effect ability. Other than that one ability though, I really like the rest of Emily's abilities. Yes, this is where the positives start rolling in, and obviously I won't be discussing Corvo's abilities in this game since I didn't play as him, and anyway, I believe his abilities were pretty similar if outright not the same as the ones from the first game. So, what does Emily bring to the table in this game in terms of abilities? Well, first she has a far reach ability, which is basically Corvo's blink ability combined with Daud's pull ability. Emily will fire a tentacle across the map and pull herself to a different location, as well as being able to pull objects and people to her. I did have some problems with this ability, as sometimes I'd be aiming at a specific pedestal or rooftop that I should be able to reach, and it just wouldn't let me go to it unless I was looking at it from a specific angle. But other than that, this was a cool ability for Emily to have. She also has a doppelganger ability that I never actually used that allows her to summon shadows of herself, as well as my favourite ability in the game, Domino. Domino allows you to link up to a maximum of 4 enemies so that whatever happens to one of them happens to all of them. This was really useful, as for example, you could link 4 enemies, then shoot one of them with a sleep dart, which this game only gives you a maximum of 5, and then all 4 enemies would be knocked out. Or you could domino some enemies using far reach to get behind one of them, then choke them out whilst the other guards watch you, and then as they try and rush you, watch as they one by one fall to the floor unconscious. Emily's abilities all work very well with one another. She also has Mesmerize, which I never used, and Shadow Walk, which I only used a couple of times. The gameplay in Dishonored 2 is also a lot more refined than in Dishonored 1. It is much easier to take the game on non-lethally, and there are a lot more options for stealth in this game. In the first game, you could only do certain actions lethally, such as drop assassinations. In Dishonored 2, every lethal action has a non-lethal counterpart. You could do non-lethal drop assassinations, you could slide tackle a guy into a non-lethal knockout, there are stun mines. Throwing objects at people's heads can knock them out. You can even do full combat with enemies and finish them off in a non-lethal way. None of this, unless I'm misremembering, was possible in the first game. The developers clearly realised that telling people that they'll get a better ending playing non-lethally will result in them trying to play the game that way, and thus they added a lot more options for non-lethal players. I'm also glad that they fixed an annoying problem from the first game, where if you try and knock out an enemy, but the option isn't there to do it, you just end up alerting them. In Dishonored 2, if you miss time knocking out an enemy and instead shield yourself, it shouldn't alert the enemy in front of you. The gameplay is definitely a step up from the first one. However, the real crowning achievement of this game is the level design. This game has some of the best level design I've ever seen for a video game. In fact, Dishonored 2 may have the best level design I've ever seen in any video game. I don't know for certain, I can't remember every game that I've ever played, but Dishonored 2 is certainly up there. The level design in the first game was great, with certain levels sticking out in my memory, but the level design here is spectacular, the Clockwork Mansion undoubtedly being the high point of the game. The moment the environment started to shift about, I practically lost it. It's such a cool level that was executed perfectly. In fact, the Clockwork Mansion may just be my favourite level in any video game ever. It is brilliant. It reminds me of a certain level from Control. Anyone who has played the game could probably guess which level I'm talking about. Yes, the game never manages to match how good this level is after this point, but that doesn't mean that the levels after are weak. No, they're great too. I really like the Duke's mansion, for example. It was fun trying to find his doppelganger and convincing him to go against his master, or the one level where every now and then a large dust cloud / sandstorm completely obscures your view. This game is worth playing purely for the variety and the fantastic level design on offer here. Dishonored 2 may have a subjectively weaker story than the first, with less interesting characters and an anticlimactic ending, but the refinement of the level design and gameplay make Dishonored 2 a must-play in my opinion. Lastly, there's Dishonored Death of the Outsider, which aims to wrap up the stories of Billy Lurk, Daud, and the Outsider. The Outsider seems to be a very divisive character. Personally, I neither loved him or hated him and didn't really care about Billy's and Daud's plan to put an end to the Outsider's life. Honestly, the most interesting thing to me about the Outsider is that in Dishonored 2 and Death of the Outsider, he's played by Robin Lord Taylor, who played the Penguin in Gotham. Man, he was great in that show. My disinterest in The Outsider, combined with the Dishonored DLC potentially being my least favourite part of Dishonored, led to me once again not caring about this game's story. It's fine. Although, other than The Outsider, I don't remember a single target in this game. Billy, like Daud, Corvo and Emily, has her own set of abilities, but unlike them, they can't be upgraded. Billy has a Displace ability, which is essentially her version of Blink. She has Foresight, which is this cool ability where she can have an out-of-body experience version of Dark Vision that also stops time. You can also disguise yourself as other people, which is a neat trick that I used a couple of times. And you also get your hands on a cool sword that can send people flying into the air. Oh, and Billy can also talk to rats, but I rarely used that ability, and when I did, it didn't even help. Other than these new abilities, the gameplay is the same as Dishonored 2. The level design is once again good, but there weren't any levels that wowed me like in Dishonored 2. The best part of Death of the Outsider is the contracts that you can do in each mission. Each level has a bunch of side contracts that you can do, not dissimilar to side activities in the other Dishonored games. However, I always enjoy going out of my way to get these contracts and completing them, especially since you get a major monetary reward in the game for doing them. Dishonored Death of the Outsider is just more Dishonored, and if you like Dishonored, you'll like Death of the Outsider. The Dishonored series is over 10 years old now and has aged like a fine wine due to the freedom players have in taking on well-sculpted levels. Whilst the story wasn't my cup of tea, that doesn't mean it won't be yours, and there's every chance that you'll love the full Dishonored package, whereas I only really like the gameplay, level design and story of the first game. Let me know what you think of Dishonored in the comments below. Do you prefer Dishonored or Dishonored 2? all about the Dishonored DLC and Death of the Outsider. Hopefully you enjoyed this video and will stick around for the next one. Anyway, bye bye.